Good day. I am Marianne Jennifer M. Gaerlan from De La Salle University, and I'm going to be presenting my study entitled Translating Young Adult Fiction from English, the Visibility of the Filipino Translator and its Implications on the Teaching and Learning of Literary Works. I actually became interested in the concept of the visibility of the translator because it's one of the topics in a course that I teach called Translation Studies. And I really believe that the willingness of the translator to be visible has implications on the manner by which a text is understood and appreciated. And I think it really does have some implications on the teaching and learning, specifically of literary works. So culture-specific items are inevitable in any text, and this is partly what makes translation challenging. Of particular interest to translation scholars are translations of culture-specific items in children's and young adults' books. As observed by Saber Mahani and Gazizadeh in 2017, children and even young adults have a limited amount of knowledge and language ability, and thus translators of novels for this audience may encounter some difficulties while dealing with culture-specific terms. They cannot easily decide whether to retain, or what we call foreignize, or naturalize such terms. Ings in 2003 observed that in Russian translations of the following works, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, he observed that the approach to translation is largely random and that there was no attempt on the part of the translators to situate the stories in a Russian context. So the translators in this case have retained intact both the cultural backdrop and the moral values put forward in the original works. And we're pretty sure that the translators have their own reasons for retaining the original culture in these works. So this is a clear example of foreignization in translation. On the other hand, Petrulione in 2012 described the strategies used to translate two Joanne Harris's novels into Lithuanian and found that the strategy of localization, which is similar to domestication and naturalization, has been used most often. Alwazna in 2014 on the problem of a mediation between language and culture in any translation task argues for using domestication or naturalization as a cultural translation strategy. This strategy has predominantly been employed in Arabic English translation by Western translators so that target texts would be produced in such a way that fits the culture of the target language and lives up to the expectations of the target reader. So we can see here that at least in the literature that was reviewed for this particular exploratory study, more translators tend to favor naturalization because they are more they take into consideration the target audience or the culture of the target reader. So regarding the concept of visibility, how visible are translators? Normally, we see the product, the translation itself, but we don't really see the process, what goes on behind the scenes, or what processes the translators underwent prior to producing the translated material. Peter Bush, the award-winning translator of Spanish poet Juan Goytisolo, complains about the way in which translators are rendered invisible to readers. And he says, Most readers of translations prefer not to know, we are told by most publishers, who prefer to keep the translator stowed out of sight, and most academic translation specialists, who ought to be heralds of the art, prefer to keep their linguistic science unpolluted by the messy, inventive, irksome experiences of professional literary translators engaged in the adventure of multiple rereadings and rewritings of the carefully placed words of another writer in another language. So this is the visibility or lack thereof of the translator, evident or not in their translations. In education, where translated work is utilized as teaching material, it is important to analyze the translation strategies of translators because their visibility or lack thereof greatly influences the accessibility, understanding, and appreciation of literary work. And depending on the content, the translator is in fact empowered depending on the level of visibility because he or she has the power to convert or revise the original material into something that is more attuned to the culture of the target reader. The present study thus aimed to explore strategies used by Filipino translators in translating culture-specific terms into popular young adult novels in English. Stephanie Perkins's Anna and the French Kiss and Kiera Cass's The Selection to ascertain the visibility of the Filipino translator. It is hoped that the results of this exploratory investigation will reveal Filipino translators' stance on visibility and be a springboard for a subsequent investigation on how this affects the teaching and learning of these materials. This study also endeavors to contribute to the ongoing discussion and hopefully revive interest in and research on translation and translation studies in the Philippines. So this descriptive qualitative study investigated the procedures that two Filipino translators used to translate culture-specific terms into young adult novels in English. The corpus of this study comprised of two novels. Anna and the French Kiss was translated by Sara Bulalakaw and The Selection was translated by Susie R. Baclagon Borrero. These two novels were selected for analysis due to their availability and popularity among Filipino young adult readers of fiction. The parallel corpus, the English novels, and their Filipino translations was scrutinized and culture-specific terms including names, domestic life and activities, measurements, etc. were detected. Thereafter, the strategy or strategies applied to translate each of these items were identified. The strategies were combined from taxonomies introduced by Aixelá in 1996, Davies in 2003, Fernandes in 2006, and Klingberg back in 1986. These strategies included transliteration, rendition, convention, substitution, intratextual addition, extratextual addition, naturalization, omission, and cultural dilution. The results generally reveal the tendency of Filipino translators to be more target text-oriented. This is apparent in the frequency of use of the strategy of naturalization, which is used to make translation more transparent and fluent for the target text readers. In this case, the translator reproduces a cultural reference with its closest natural equivalent in the target language. It therefore refers to the substitution of a source culture reference with a target one. And this tendency implies that the Filipino translator is willing or wants to be visible. These are some examples of naturalization of culture-specific terms. The English term is snake pit, and it was translated to preso. So we can see here that it's naturalized for the benefit of the target audience who are Filipino readers, because we can see here that preso is very familiar, more familiar in the Filipino culture. So snake pit is not is it's very Western. So we don't really refer to snake pit. We don't really use the term snake pit in the Philippines. And as a matter of fact, it's not really an equivalent translation because there's no such thing. But a literal translation would not be possible either, as snake pit is actually an idiomatic expression. So the translation using naturalization as a strategy is preso. So snake pit is equated to prison or somewhere, a place where one is trapped. Another strategy, another word where another cultural specific term that was naturalized by the translators here is the term freckles, which was translated to pecas. So we are familiar with the term pecas. It's actually something that's not very desirable in the Philippine culture because Filipinos value smooth skin, and pecas sort of connotes skin imperfection, and this is the closest translation that the translators were able to manage because freckles is a culture specific term. So when we think of freckles, we don't really, it's not Asians or Filipinos in particular who come to mind. Although I think freckles are not specific only to certain nationalities or cultures, but I think it's less common among Filipinos. The tendency to use naturalization may imply Filipino translators' desire to ensure that their translations are accessible and relatable. And this contrasts with results from previous studies such as Bermahani and Gasizades, which found that the use of naturalization and substitution was so rare in all translations by Persian translators, showing their preference to avoid domestication as much as possible. So they'd rather, as I said earlier, they'd really rather retain the culture of the original work. Also, Filipino translators do make use of omission as a strategy, meaning if there is really no way to translate a culture-specific term, then they will merely omit that term. While Persian translators do not do that. And this, to some extent, emphasizes Persian translators' attempt to be faithful to the source material. Another commonly used translation strategy by the Filipino translators in this particular study was rendition, which involves translating a term by its meaning. Because rendition is a strategy in which the sense of the culture-specific term is rendered in the target language, it is actually very similar to naturalization. Thus, this again reveals that Filipino translators make certain that their versions or their translations are target text and target culture oriented. And here are some examples of rendition. The English phrase is, our money was tight as a high wire. And the translation is, mahirap ang pera. So there was an attempt to find an equivalent in the Filipino culture. So because tight as a high wire is a metaphor, it cannot be translated word for word or literally. So this is the closest that the translators were able to manage, and they were able to retain the meaning. So, our money was tight as a high wire translates to mahirap ang pera. Another example of rendition is translating the term or the description stuck up little wimp. In the Filipino culture, we don't have an equivalent for wimp, at least not an exact equivalent. But in my experience, or at least based on other translations that I have come across, wimp is more synonymous to somebody who is not very confident, somebody who's easily bullied, somebody who is meek and submissive, which is ironic because in this description, the word stuck up is used to describe the little wimp. And the rendition produces the translation, arroganteng walang silbi. Arrogante is actually very close to the original term, which is stuck up. But little wimp may not be equivalent to walang silbi. But in the Filipino culture, since rendition aims to do that, to find to give the meaning in the target culture, then arroganting walang silbi will be the best possible translation in this case, at least for the translators in this particular study. Filipino translators also use cultural dilution, which is a strategy that aims to produce a more general or neutral rendition so that target readers can more easily understand the cultural backgrounds of the source text. The term magnetic, which is synonymous to attractive, was translated to nakakabighani, which is an adjective that is very Filipino. Another culture-specific term, absolute heathen, was translated to hampas lupa, which is actually not the equivalent term, as heathen actually refers to pagano or a pagan, but with cultural dilution and the context in which the culture-specific term was used, the translator apparently opted to favor a target reader familiar term. So heathen apparently in Tagalog can translate to hampas lupa because I think this insult is something that is more familiar in the Filipino culture, being hampas lupa, but heathen is not. So insults apparently are one of the more difficult uh, terms or items to translate. So to conclude, we can see here that target-oriented strategies are more utilized by the Filipino translators to prioritize making the text more comprehensible and relatable over retaining the culture of the original text. And the dominance of these strategies points to these Filipino translators' inclination to be invisible in their work, which may have implications on the use of these materials for teaching and learning purposes. Because translations are actually versions or rewritings of the original work, then the impact of this material when they are used for teaching cannot be ignored or overlooked. In fact, if it's only the translation that is available, then technically that is the only work that that will be accessible to the target readers, right? Unless they exert effort to access the original material and do a comparison. So this exploratory investigation hopes to revive the interest in translation studies, especially specifically here in the Philippines, where the mother tongue-based multilingual education policy necessitates the translation of educational materials into many different mother tongues, and where the Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino, or the KWF, advocates for the development and advancement of translation in the country. Thank you.